Eminem wasn't built for this world. Not the music industry. Not hip-hop. Not the stage he would eventually stand on. Because before any of that, there was nothing stable to build on. No system. No support. No place that held long enough to feel permanent. Just movement. From one place to another. From one situation to the next. Always temporary. Always uncertain. And in environments like that, people don't usually develop direction. They develop survival. That's where the story begins. Not with talent. Not with ambition. But with instability. Because when there's no foundation, every step forward feels like it could collapse. And most of the time it does. Which raises a different question. Not how someone succeeds, but how someone like this even gets the chance to try. It didn't start with opportunity. It started with instability. Moving from place to place. Not by choice, but because nothing lasted long enough to stay.
Homes weren't permanent.
Schools weren't consistent. Even people weren't reliable. And when everything around you keeps changing, you don't build connections. You build distance. At school, it didn't get easier. It got worse. Being different wasn't just noticeable. It was a target. Fights weren't rare. They were expected. There were moments where it went beyond that. Where it stopped being about conflict and became about damage. Physical. Real. Lasting. And outside of that, there was no real support system to fall back on. No structure.
No stability.
Just a cycle that repeated itself. Uncertainty. Tension. Isolation. Over and over again. This wasn't a temporary phase. It was the environment. And environments like that don't produce confidence. They produce something else. Awareness. Of where you are. Of what you don't have. Of how far removed you are from anything that looks like a clear path forward. At this point, the idea of success doesn't exist. Because there's no reference for it. There's only one focus. Getting through it. At some point, survival wasn't enough. There had to be something else. Not stability. Not a clear future. Just something different from everything that came before. That's where music entered. Not as a plan. Not as a solution. But as an outlet. A way to take everything that didn't have a place and give it one. But the space he stepped into wasn't built for him. Hip-hop at that time had its own structure. Its own identity. Its own rules. And he didn't fit any of them. Not culturally. Not visually. Not historically. Which meant one thing. He wasn't just another beginner. He was an outsider. And in a space built on authenticity, being an outsider isn't neutral. It's a disadvantage. Every performance wasn't just about skill. It was about legitimacy. Every verse wasn't just heard. It was judged. Closely. Constantly. Because before anything else, there was a question that didn't go away. Why is he here? And more importantly, does he deserve to be? That question followed him everywhere. Through small stages. Through crowded rooms. Through moments where one mistake was enough to confirm every doubt. This wasn't just competition. It was pressure. Because failure didn't just mean losing. It meant proving everyone right. At some point, effort stops feeling like progress. And starts feeling like repetition. The same attempts. The same rooms. The same outcomes. Nothing changing. He was still writing. Still performing. Still showing up. But showing up doesn't guarantee movement. And movement is the only thing that matters. In an industry that never slows down. There were no deals. No clear opportunities. No signal that any of it was leading somewhere. Just time passing. And pressure building. Financial pressure. Personal pressure. The kind that doesn't stay in one place. Follows you. Into every decision. Into every moment where you start to question. If continuing even makes sense. Because at some point the question changes. It's no longer, can this work? It becomes, is this even worth it? And that's where most people stop. Not because they lack ability. But because the return is no longer visible. For him, that point wasn't theoretical. It was real. Close enough to ending. That continuing felt irrational. And when something feels irrational long enough, it usually ends. At some point, the effort to be accepted stopped making sense. Trying to fit into a system that never intended to include you has a limit. And once that limit is reached, something changes. Not gradually, completely. He stopped trying to be understood. Stopped trying to match expectations. Stopped adjusting himself to fit a space that kept rejecting him. And in that shift, something else appeared. Not a refined version. Not a polished identity. But something raw, unfiltered, unpredictable, uncomfortable, slim shady. It wasn't created to be accepted. It was created to exist. Without permission. Without approval. And that changed the dynamic. because now the goal wasn't to prove he belonged. It was to become impossible to ignore. The tone shifted. The content became sharper, more direct, more aggressive, not controlled, not safe. And that's what made it work. Because in a space where authenticity is everything, being filtered is a weakness. But being real, even if it's chaotic, forces attention. For the first time, the reaction wasn't uncertainty. It was impact. And impact doesn't ask for approval. It demands it. The shift didn't stay underground. It didn't stay contained. Because once it reached the right place, it accelerated. A meeting, a studio. And suddenly the environment changed. Dr. Dre heard it. Not the noise. Not the controversy. The potential. And that was enough. Everything moved faster after that. No slow build. No gradual climb. Just momentum. Immediate. Aggressive. Unstoppable. The music didn't get safer. It got louder. Sharper. More direct. And instead of pushing people away, pulled attention in. Everywhere. The name started appearing in places it hadn't been before. Radio. Television. Crowds that were no longer small. And no longer selective. He wasn't trying to break through anymore. He already had. And once that happens, the rules change. Because now, the same things that once worked against him became the reason people paid attention. The difference, the tension, the discomfort. It didn't disappear. It scaled. And scale is what turns impact into presence. At that point, he wasn't being questioned anymore. He was being watched. And once you reach that level of attention, ignoring you is no longer an option. What happened next wasn't random. It followed a pattern. At the beginning, everything worked against him. The background, the environment, the fact that he didn't belong. Normally, those things limit a career. In his case, they defined it. Because instead of removing those differences, he amplified them. The rejection didn't disappear. It became part of the identity. The tension didn't go away. It became the reason people paid attention. And once attention is there, the dynamic changes. Because in a space where everyone is trying to fit in, being impossible to fit becomes an advantage. That's the system. Not talent alone. Not luck. But positioning. Turning what should have been a barrier into something that couldn't be ignored. And once that happens, control follows. Not because people accept you, but because they can't avoid you. At the start, there was no clear path. No structure. No place that made sense. Just instability. And a position that didn't belong anywhere. Most people in that position don't build something from it. They get filtered out by it. Because systems don't reward what doesn't fit. They remove it. Unless it becomes too visible to ignore. That's the difference. He didn't come from the bottom. He came from a place where there was no foundation at all. And instead of trying to fix that, he used it, not to fit in, but to stand out, completely.